Looking at their music specifically, and I guess even so at post 1964 after their arrival in America, what sustained that popularity, at least in terms of their music style, and what might you suggest their music style is, or and what separated them maybe from other bands at the time that they were possibly competing against for popularity and interest?
Yeah, it's interesting. You look at Beatles interviews with them from that era, and they don't know what's going on either. All they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out what the next big thing is going to be. And I forget who said this, but somebody pointed out that they never quite realized that the next big thing was always them. They always managed to find, they're always doing something a little bit different from what everybody else was doing. Even, the rockabilly stuff in their repertoire really did kind of mark them as different through that era. You look at the album Beatles for Sale, which is late 1964, or even into the Help album from 1965. There's still country western stuff in there, right? It was an important part of their identity, their musical style. So you can close the door if you want. So yeah, they were always a little bit different. The big changeover starts to happen in late '65 into 1966, when they are really kind of fed up with touring. The touring was brutal on them, and you can see them complaining about this and just deciding that they didn't want to do this anymore, and their emphasis and their focus turned inward into the studio. And when you're recording in the studio, many of these, the inclination to include more of that rockabilly stuff began to fade. And the other thing is too is that George Harrison, who we often leave out of this equation, is growing other interests. He's becoming interested in Indian music. So the point at which we start to see the Carl Perkins tunes dropping out of their literature, their catalog as such, is the point at which he's starting to play the sitar. So Rubber Soul and Revolver, that country western stuff starts to fade away, and we're starting to get sitar stuff in there. So instead of, they still are doing, they're still doing kind of country western style things like Run for Your Life, and What Goes On, for example, right? These are still kind of rockabilly tinged things, but you're also now getting Norwegian Wood on Rubber Soul. And on Revolver, you're getting Love Me Too. Love You Too, sorry. Love Me Too and Love You Too. So that sensibility, that aesthetic is beginning to change.
Right.
And as a consequence, I mean, they're influenced too. At that point, they're influenced not only by Bob Dylan, but by the Beach Boys. So if you can kind of imagine the Beach Boys and Bob Dylan kind of, spoken through the Beatles, that's maybe one way to think about what happens in '65 and '66.
I do want to get to the Indian music effect, but I do want to ask you about, I know Paul McCartney, as you said, that he was highly influenced by the Beach Boys, especially when they came out with that album Pet Sounds. I think he felt almost like a sense of, like he had to catch up, and he felt there was a little bit of competition now. He had to put out a good album.
If you look at British newspapers, the Beach Boys were hugely popular in the UK. Huge. I mean, we would often think that, no, in the UK, that would be the Beatles. I mean, you have nothing with the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys would be relatively unimportant in Britain, but that was not the case. The Beach Boys were huge. If you read newspapers from the era, you can see that the Beach Boys often dominated the press. It's amazing.
Did they feel any competition with any other maybe rising British bands at the time too?
Well, there's certainly competition. Other rising bands is obviously the Rolling Stones. But the Rolling Stones were always playing catch up to the Beatles, and that was pretty clear until about 1968 or so. If you look at what the Rolling Stones do in the way that their manager Andrew Oldham manipulated them, their image, right up through 1967, they're always basically imitating the Beatles. 2 months and 3 styles behind them.
So let's get to the Indian. So they obviously spent some time in India studying, I guess what they call transcendental meditation with the Maharishi, and then George Harrison, as you mentioned, even more time with Ravi Shankar.
His stuff with Ravi Shankar started before that. That started in 1966.
Right. Before or they all studied with the Maharishi.
That was 1968.
So, and you can hear those influences, at least in George Harrison songs, clear, overt influences, and as you mentioned, Love You Too, and Within You, Without You. I mean, those are clear, overt Indian influences. But maybe specifically on the Lennon-McCartney songwriting team, or on the Beatles in general, what did that Indian culture, or them spending time there, or did it have an effect on their songwriting?
You know, I don't see a great influence on Lennon and McCartney. The only thing I could point to in the Lennon-McCartney catalog that might show some Indian influence, obvious in the Indian influence, it would be something like Tomorrow Never Knows, which has the drone kind of running through it. But then they're not even using an Indian text, they're using a Tibetan text. You know, I suppose still South Asian, but you know, it's Mahayana Buddhism, not Hinduism. Yeah, that I don't see that there's a huge influence on Lennon and McCartney. Across the Universe, I guess, a little bit, but in many ways Across the Universe, although it even has the Jai Guru Deva and Om in it, that's almost cliched. It works in the song for the most part, but the song itself doesn't show much influence of musical materials don't show much Indian influence.
All right. And George Harrison, he was once quoted as saying, in September 1969, I'm stealing this from Jonathan Gould's book, Can't Buy Me Love, he mentioned that, I just can't get any complete impression of Abbey Road. With Pepper and even the White Album, I get an overall image of the complete product. But with this one, I'm still at a loss. I think it's a bit like Revolver, but I still feel very abstract about it. I just can't see it as a whole entity yet. To me, listening to Abbey Road is a bit like listening to someone else. It doesn't feel like the Beatles. So, what I want to ask of you is, what is your impression of the three albums, namely that of Sgt. Pepper's and the White Album and Abbey Road, and what do you think of George Harrison's assessment?
Well, the Abbey Road album is interesting. After you realize there's an album that should be in between there that doesn't happen. So we've got Sgt. Pepper, that's 1967. Magical Mystery Tour, which we left out of here too, which was released as an EP in the UK, and as an album, as an LP in the US, but that has new material on it too. Blue Jay Way, you know, I Am the Walrus, that stuff, Magical Mystery Tour, Fool on the Hill. So there's that material there. The double White Album, the Beatles, is in many ways it's interesting that Harrison sees that as a Beatles album, whereas that's really an album where they're kind of starting to fragment and go their own separate ways. The album that doesn't appear is the Get Back album in early 1969. That should have appeared in the first half of 1969. They hit into the studio in January of '69. They're going to record in their rehearsals for a performance, and then so you'll have all of this rehearsal footage and then the live concert, right? Well, the live concert never really happened except on the rooftop, and that's as close as they could get to it. But the infighting and the fragmentation of the band just has continued from the White Album through into 1969, so that by the time they actually agree to do a last album, which is Abbey Road, yeah, you've got side one, which is individual songs, and you've got, you know, some great songs on there. You got Harrison's Something on there, and Lennon's Come Together, you know, and you've got, and those become two sides of a single. But the side two of it is a real mishmash. You've got this extended medley that is made up of some McCartney tunes and some Lennon tunes, but it's basically it's a tape mash, right? They've taken different things and spliced them together. They're not really performing them as a live performance. So it's basically kind of leftover stuff, and they're trying to do it well. But I would agree with him. It's not a cohesive album.